The coalition governments in 6 of the 8 metros in South Africa, with political coalitions seemingly a feature of councils in some of the country's biggest metros. It might well be time now to draw lessons from those that have done it before. And in this case, Denmark. The country boasts 2 large parties and several other small but significant parties. No single party has held an absolute majority in the Danish parliament since the beginning of the 20th century. Joining us now to discuss lessons one can draw from such a multi-party system of democratic government is the Freedom Front Plus Parliamentary Chief Whip, Dr. Corne Mulder, who is also the chairperson of the Coalition Technical Committee. Dr. Mulder, very good afternoon. Thanks so much for speaking to us. I suppose the first question is, are there any glaring differences to coalitions in Denmark and in South Africa?
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity. Well, yes, I think there are huge differences in certain instances. Let me start off. The first question would be, why coalitions in the first place? And you get into the reality of coalitions the moment when your democracy develops to the point where no single one party will get an outright majority. Now, we haven't been in that position throughout South Africa since 1994, and the Western Cape as well, in terms of the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape and the ANC on the national level. But there are huge differences between our coalitions up to this point, I think, and what we saw in Denmark when we were fortunate to visit there about 2 weeks ago. The Danish coalitions have developed over many, many years, more than hundreds of years, and they've got a different approach to coalitions, and I think we still need to get there, and our coalitions are not mature enough to do exactly what we have learned in the Danish experience.
Okay, now you haven't quite given us any of those differences, which I'm obviously keen to understand.
Yes.
But before you answer that question, is there a way of bridging that learning curve and not having to wait hundreds of years before we get to a mature democracy?
Absolutely. I don't think we have any other choice. I think South Africa and the electorate demands that we quickly go through that process. We don't have time for a long learning process. We need to jump and get there immediately. And let me just highlight then perhaps the more important differences in that instance. I think the most important difference that I saw, and I think that we still need to get under our belt in South Africa, is this. There's a huge difference between a party that does not have a majority on its own and then wants to co-opt some other parties because they need a couple of votes so that they can govern, as to where the largest party realizes that coalitions means to co-govern with other parties and to treat them as partners in that co-governance. So in other words, what we saw in the Danish experience was that the biggest party in any coalition, that specific party should set the example, they should take the lead, but they should also be the humblest of all, because they've got the most to lose if they do not succeed in accommodating the other smaller parties so that they can jointly form a majority. And I think that is one of the things that we lack in the South African experience, where some of the larger parties maybe think that they can just co-opt some of the other smaller parties so that they can govern technically alone with those votes. That is not what we need, and I think that is perhaps why some of our coalitions have failed in the past.
Now, let's talk about conflict resolutions and the mechanisms around that, because that's actually a big issue, that there is conflict, and the minute that you have conflict, there's an apparent dissolution of some of these coalitions. What are the conflict resolution measures adopted by the Danes?
Well, the fact is that I think one of the points that they are very strongly about is the fact that you should build those coalitions not only in terms of agreed upon points of departure and principles as a point of foundation for your coalition, but they place a huge emphasis on interpersonal relations between individuals. In other words, yes, you've got local parties and all the different institutions that are involved in those coalitions. But in the end, many of those conflicts are resolved by interpersonal contact between individuals who make a point of getting to know one another and to reach out to one another so that they understand each other. In other words, there may be party structures that don't understand, that put impossible positions forward, but it's quite often individuals on a personal level that succeed in reaching out and breaching the gaps. And if you look at, for example, at different mechanisms and structures that they create to try and facilitate those kind of conflicts, and in most instances they succeed, and we need to learn those lessons as well.
Now, are there agreements currently in local politics when coalition governments are formed? Is there an MOU of some sort that is signed? I presume that there are definitely no gentlemen's agreements in politics.
No. If you look in South Africa, for example, I heard that the ANC the other day said that a handshake is good enough. They'll be in for a surprise. A handshake means nothing in these days. No. The coalition agreements that we are involved in South Africa are based on written agreements that we've negotiated with our partners, and we've gone through that process. And you have to have that, because a coalition can never be just because of dividing positions. That will never last. I think we learned that lesson in 2016 when coalitions failed, because in those instances it was mostly about, I want to be the mayor and you can be the speaker. It should not be about positions. It should be about service delivery. It should be about common fundamental principles in terms of which you agree in terms of policy. And we've succeeded in doing that in coalition agreements, and that's also something that we saw from the Danish side, that you have to find common ground on a principle basis, and then you can build on that. It's absolutely essential, and we have learned that lesson, and we will improve those coalition agreements as we move along, because we've also learned some lessons in the conflict resolution phase of that process.
Now, Dr. Mulder, you've talked about humility being a key aspect to a functional coalition government. How do you educate politicians in South Africa to reach these levels of humility that allow functionality and progression of coalition governments?
I think the electorate is going to teach political parties a lesson at the polls, because the electorate in the final analysis will give their judgment in terms of what they see that play out in front of their eyes. In other words, what does the electorate want? They want successful, stable coalitions that succeed in governing, that succeed in service delivery, etc. And they take cognizance of the fact, and they quickly see which parties are blaming each other and why coalitions fail. And in the end, it will be the electorate with the exercise of their vote that in the end will support some parties and will punish other parties for their behavior. So I think politicians and political parties need to learn the lesson very quickly. You can never be too humble in politics if you are seriously in there to serve the people and to act in the best interest of the electorate. That should be your point of departure. It can never be about an individual. It can never be about someone's career or someone's legacy. It should be exactly the opposite. And parties who do not understand that, I predict, will be punished at the polls when we come to the election in 2024.
Now, you're chairperson of the Coalition Technical Committee. Talk to us about the report that you've submitted to Parliament on that visit to Denmark.
Well, the fact is that I think it was a very important exercise. It started off about in December of 2019. There was a similar visit of a group of politicians from different political parties that went to Berlin in Germany on invitation of the German government, and this was a follow-up on invitation of the Danish government. This time around, 8 political parties participated. And the important thing was that it's all the major parties, all the serious contenders in South Africa in our democracy. The ANC was present, Democratic Alliance was there, the EFF participated, Freedom Front Plus, Action SA, which is a newcomer in terms of not being represented in Parliament yet, but they will be after 2024, the UDM and others all participated. So I think that was quite important. And it's important that we take that message back, and that all those parties take the message back in terms of the lessons that we've learned, because it's a learning curve, and this will certainly not be the last in that process. And that's why it was important to report on that and to bring those messages back so that we can all learn and improve, because in the end, as I've said, it's about the electorate and service delivery. It's not about politicians or positions. It can never be.
Now, you've suggested that key learnings will be made or will be had at the polls, and that's in 2024. Now, let's go back to 2019 and that visit to Berlin. What were the lessons that were drawn from that visit, and have any of those lessons been implemented in the last 3 years?
Absolutely, I think so, yes, because what we learned in 2019, for example, was that quite successful coalitions should preferably be negotiated on local levels, specifically in local government situations. In other words, the parties from national levels should not try to influence and direct the whole process. Yes, they can give some broad guidelines, but the actual negotiations should be done on a local level, because the local circumstances will be different from municipality to municipality, from metro to metro. You can't have one-size-fits-all kind of approach. That was the first one. The second one, which we learned from the German experience at that time, was that positions should be right at the end. The formation of the government should be right at the end of the process. You start off by finding partners on a principled basis that you can work with and that you have got an agreement on policy. So both of those things were implemented after 2021. And we succeeded to a very large extent. The one problem that we did have at the moment, and we still have that problem, is the fact that in our electoral system, there's no cut-off percentage that you need to have so many percentage of support before you get people elected. So quite often, the ideal would be to have less parties in a coalition and not so many parties. We've got examples in the Western Cape, for example, in a number of municipalities where the coalition government at the moment consists of two parties, the Democratic Alliance and the Freedom Front Plus. And it's quite a splendid exercise to have those kind of coalitions where parties understand one another and govern in the best interest. But then you come to Nelson Mandela Bay, for example, which is a metro, and you've got 10 parties in that coalition, and 5 or 6 of them are one-member parties. And we love their support, and we're very happy about that. But it's very difficult to have so many parties, and it's quite difficult because we also have an abnormal situation where not everybody accepts the fact that they've lost power, and then a lot of pressure is applied on those one-member parties to try and change their view. But the lessons we learned from Berlin, I think we have implemented them, and we've learned some more now in Denmark. It's a question of how do we go forward, and we'll also need the support of the electorate. My view is that in exercising their vote in 2024, they should identify some 4 or 5 or 6 parties that I think are big enough, that are stable enough, and that are responsible enough, that the electorate should look at their policies and exercise their vote between those parties so that we can have less parties to form stable coalitions.
Fabulous speaking to you, Dr. Mulder. Appreciate your time this afternoon.